see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogs on how to build a culture of empathy. And today I'm here with Dan Siegel. Thanks, Dan, for joining me for this dialogue.
You're welcome, Edwin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I wanted to give a little bit of background about you. I see you're a clinical professor of psychology at UCLA School of Medicine. And also
psychiatry, yes.
Of psychiatry, and executive director of the MindSight Institute. And I've looked at your books on Amazon. There's so many of them. It's quite amazing how prolific you are. But I'll just mention two of them that kind of jumped out at me. One is The Mindful Brain, Reflection and Attunement in the Cultivation of Well-Being. And you have it looks like the most current one is The Developing Mind, second edition, How Relationships and the Brain Interact to Shape Who We Are.
Yes.
Great. So, and also you have a website. It's drdansiegel.com. That's drdansiegel.com.
Yeah.
So is there anything?
And Siegel.com, right. And there are a few other books, that might be of interest to people on parenting, the whole brain child and parenting from the inside out, which I wrote with two colleagues, Tina Bryson and Mary Hartzell, and then a whole series of books through Norton. So there are lots of written resources for people, as well as online things and video and audio programs.
Yeah, so what we want to do, was there more you'd like to say in terms of introduction? I mean, you've done a lot with children, study child development, and
yeah, I mean, the question of compassion, is so important because the world is really desperately needing ways to promote more compassion in our society, in our schools, in our homes. And so anything I think we can do together as a team to bring more compassion into the world, I think is really important.
Well, to start these dialogues, one way I like to start them is just finding out what the person I'm talking to, what their most important value is and how that value became important to them. So what would you say is your most important value, and how did that become important?
Well, I would say compassion is probably the most important value, and it comes in the form of self-compassion, being kind to yourself, and also compassion for others, being empathic and understanding. And I think that comes from both personal experience in my family and the family now that I have with my own kids and wife, and then in my professional work. That when you look scientifically at well-being, compassion is a natural outcome, I think, when we strive for well-being in ourselves and others. And so compassion is a good summary, I think, of what ties things together.
Oh,
so
yeah. Well, my focus is kind of more around the empathy part of it, and I know you've done a lot around the definition of the mind, and that you really value definitions. So perhaps we could start with your definition of empathy and compassion.
Well, they're really interesting words, aren't they? Empathy and compassion, and you could even throw in kindness in there too. There are 8 different definitions of empathy. So as a word, that one often brings up a lot of more challenging agreement, because there are so many different ways of defining it. For example, empathy is used to understand another person sort of intellectually. Empathy can be used to feel another person's feelings. So an empathic response is you feel the suffering of someone else. Empathy can be used for a behavior. An empathic behavior can be used for a skill. Like, I have the skill of empathy. I can really put myself inside the mental perspective of another person. So those are just some examples. And all of those are important, of course, all those abilities. Compassion is a word that's used a little differently than empathy. It's a term that literally means to feel with. Calm is with, and passion is feel. So we're feeling with another person. And so some people use it as the emotional kind of empathy I just spoke about, the feeling another person's feeling, resonating with them. Other people use compassion more for the idea of, I sense your suffering, and so therefore I want to heal your suffering. I want to help you feel better. And so they see compassion as not just feeling with, but taking that feeling with and taking the next step of turning into action to reduce suffering. You know, um, there's also the sense of, if you're feeling with another person, what if someone's happy? Can you be compassionate for their joy? And some people don't like to use compassion that way. They like to keep it with the negative and use the word empathic joy or empathetic joy for sharing another person's joyful moments. Um, I don't know why we need to make compassion a downer exactly. People sometimes do. It's your feeling with another person negative ways. You, of course, can have compassion for another person. If you're suffering, Edwin, and I want you to feel better, I'll do something to help you feel better. But there's also self-compassion. And Kristen Neff has defined that in some lovely ways, where she talks about it having certainly being kind to yourself. So you're gentle with yourself like you would be with your best friend. It also has the quality of mindfulness, of being there in the present moment. And also it has this third aspect, which is you are able to see that you're a part of a larger human journey, and that you may have had trouble, not eating that extra cake, or, you did something you didn't want to do, and so a compassionate response for yourself would be to say, okay, I'm human. I'm just human. Doesn't mean I'll keep on trying to do that thing. I'll try to stop. I'll be responsible, but I don't have to beat up on myself. So those would be Kristen Neff's idea of self-compassion. For me, the word kindness is what connects empathy and compassion. And so I like kindness a lot as a term and as a concept. And for me, if I had to define kindness, I would say it's honoring and supporting one another's vulnerability. And that means my own vulnerability, it means your vulnerability, and realizing we have these tender places inside of ourselves that are open and fragile and not so strong or full of bravado, or it's not our public persona where we're showing public what it is, but it's this place where we really can be hurt and have needs that are sometimes unfulfilled. And it's that really deep sense of connection to an inner set of emotions and needs that the word vulnerability refers to. And so kindness then enables you to be honoring and supporting your own vulnerability, honoring and supporting another person's vulnerability, and then it links really understanding another person, empathy, sharing even in their joy, and being compassionate too. So those three words, empathy, compassion, are joined with the third word, kindness, and then we have kind of a package.
Well, so, I've noticed that in your work in general around the mind, defining the mind, you really try to pull all the different understandings together into kind of an integrative approach, and that's a little bit of what I'm seeing here, that you're kind of bringing in those different definitions. When I talked to Paul Ekman about this, he was talking about he was going to study compassion, and he said you have to go through empathy, and it's a minefield of so many different definitions, and
that's right,
and rather confusing. Typically empathy is actually culturally defined as the metaphors of standing in someone else's shoes and looking through someone else's eyes. So that's kind of another way of looking at it, is metaphorically. I was wondering if you have any metaphors of what empathy and compassion would be like.
Yeah, I have this term for me when I started training in medicine. There was this very painful moment of experiencing my teachers not sensing the internal subjective world of their patients. So they would proclaim a disease, let's say a fatal disease, and they'd move to the next room, and they wouldn't be taking a moment to actually give nurturance and support and warmth and understanding to their patient. And it was really painful for me to see. It got me to actually drop out of school for a while. And I noticed too that the professors were also not compassionate with the students. So if I was crying because a patient of mine died, I literally had a teacher of mine say, "There's no time for tears," and that's how he chose to live his life. And so, in terms of your comment, Edwin, about putting yourself in the mental perspective of another person, back then in the late 70s, early 80s, there was no term for this thing. So I just made up a term, and I had this little private term in my own head called mind sight. That the mind was, our core subjective experience, and mind sight lets you see another person's core subjective experience. So to help me understand why these really smart professors could be so blind to the mind, I had to make up a term, mind sight. So when I returned to medical school, I used that term to protect myself. And I would say, okay, this is my attending clinician. This is the physician who's going to teach me. I notice he doesn't see the inner subjective life of another person. He's lacking mind sight, I would say to myself. So use this as like an example when you go to a bad play. You don't necessarily walk out on the play, but you just say, I'll appreciate good plays more when I see this bad play. So I would watch the professor and learn about how not to be. But I had to have this word in my head. So really since 1980, mind sight as a word and as a concept has been very helpful to me. Since that time, there have been other terms that science has come up with, like theory of mind and mentalization and psychological mindedness and mind-mindedness and mentalization, reflective function, all these things that have research paradigms to look into them. But still, the word mind sight for me is really very simple. It's like if the mind is your inner subjective experience, which cannot be quantified, mind sight is the ability to see the mind in yourself and others. And basically, that's what compassion is based on, I believe.
So that would mind sight is almost like a metaphor then for empathy and compassion.
So mind sight would be the mechanism that allows empathy and compassion to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Mind sight would be the mechanism that allows emotional and social intelligence to occur. And that's what Dan Goleman wrote in the foreword to a book I wrote called Mind Sight. And so, and it's something that can be taught. That's the amazing thing, is that it's not just something you either have or don't have. It's actually something you can teach people. And so what I have been doing, since leaving medical school and going into initially pediatrics and then psychiatry and then research psychiatry and then basically being an educator in the field of mental health, is to say, well, we can define the mind, and we can also teach people how to get a stronger mind by teaching mind sight skills. Passionate. Basically, they allow kindness to emerge, not just in your actions, but in your way of being with yourself.
Yeah. What I saw in a other interview that you did, you talked about empathy, and you went through kind of the cause and effect from your neurons through the whole process into the the limbic system. I was wondering if you could and that was kind of part of the mind sight too, as I understand it. So perhaps you could just summarize that or recount that, because that was really bringing into the physicality as well of how the brain works with mirror neurons and empathy.
Right. Well, I mean, part of that process, which I'm happy to do in just a moment, is, we have to create the framework in which that process, which I'm happy to describe, is set. So that the simple thing to say is that we human beings are incredibly social. And the way we've evolved over millions of years is to connect with each other and really to be collaborative. I know people are always talking about how competitive we are, but in fact, our nature is to be collaborative as well as competitive, and people forget that. The collaboration that we have is built on a number of different amazing findings. One is we share child rearing. So unlike our primate cousins, where the mother is the sole caregiver for this little infant monkey or ape, um, you know, we actually distribute caregiving. Now that's a big deal. You as a mother have got to depend on someone you can trust. And so then you have to be able to read signals to know when a person is trustworthy or not. And so that's a big part of the beginning of empathy, is to be able to see inside the mental life of another person, to know what's really going on, because we're collaborative. The next thing about collaboration, just to be aware of, is we need to have some kind of signals to communicate with each other. So as a group, we can function as a coherent whole. If we're out hunting, or if we're gathering food, or if we're making a village together, we need to have some kind of shared signaling that became the bedrock of our species and how we evolved as a human family.
Can I just reflect what I'm hearing here is, so that the mother, if the mother is nurturing a baby, it needs some way of really reading the emotions and the needs of the baby. And
What I was actually saying was the other way. I was saying the mother needs to be able to read the emotional state of other adults.
oh, of other adults, so that they are relating and how they relate to the baby.
We'll get to the baby soon, but that's
Okay.
true in animals too. All mammals have what you're describing, where the mother's got to be able to read the signals of the baby. So that's true in mammals for over 200 million years. But in our history as humans, we do something that other mammals don't do. We hand the baby over,
Mm.
So watch her for a while. I'm going to go gather some nuts or something. Now this is really a special thing. And Sarah Hrdy talks about it beautifully in her book called Mothers and Others. And I only bring it up here because as we're about to talk about the circuitry of empathy, we need to realize is that empathy is not a luxury for human beings. It's a necessity. It's the core capacity. This ability to see the mind, to have mindsight. Mindsight is a core skill we need to evolve in the collaborative species we are. So we survive not because we have claws and not because we have big fangs. We survive because we can communicate with each other and collaborate. So that communication is about signals that go from one person to the other. Now, what are those signals? The main signals for a baby, you bring up the baby, and that's a very important starting place, are nonverbal signals: eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gestures, timing, and intensity of your responses are the 7 nonverbal signals that people use to pick up what's going on inside of another person. It's interesting that those are primarily sent by the right hemisphere of the brain, which is the side of the brain that's developing and is active in the first couple of years of a baby's life. So you get all these nonverbal signals going. What do you do as an adult when you have 2 hemispheres? The right can decode them, the left can't. You got to make sure you use your right hemisphere decoding mechanism to figure out what the nonverbal signals are. So one way of understanding a lack of empathy in my professors, for example, is the left hemisphere does not have a way of either sending or receiving nonverbal signals. It is more about linguistic output, like these words I am saying in a linear fashion that are very logically put together, making up lists, all those L's. And so if a professor has forgotten their right hemisphere for whatever reason, and certainly schools don't do much to reinforce it, and if you question what I'm saying, please read a book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, Yale University Press, 2009, and you will see what I'm talking about. So you may say, oh, Dan is like not making any sense. Just read the book and then let's talk. So here's the idea. You can show that these mindsight skills are primarily, at least initially, in the right hemisphere before they go all over the brain. But the pathway is I'm picking up nonverbal signals from you, and these signals come and are being picked up by all sorts of perceptual systems: what I hear, what I see, even what I smell, everything. I'm getting a whole sensory immersion in you, Edwin, right? So here's what happens then. One step is, among many steps, but this one step is there are these areas we now understand called mirror neurons in my frontal and parietal areas here, they start working with an area called the superior temporal sulcus, a non-mirror neuron area, to basically see, can I make a coherent sequence of what you're doing? Is there a predictable sequence of actions? So if I go like this, you may not know what I'm doing, but if I take this glass and if it were filled and I went like this, you would know what I'm doing. So the same action with an object, a cup, gives you a predictable sequence. Now, what happens is when you can determine a predictable sequence, these areas, the frontal and parietal mirror neuron areas and the superior temporal sulcus, they make a neural firing pattern that is a representation or a map of what's going on in another person's mind.
So as I'm watching you here, you're very, you use your hands a lot. So as you're really pointing out things, your here, the hair. So I'm watching those movements, and those movements, I'm kind of registering those movements.
So now what happens inside of you is, well, we'll go through this. In sequence, you're going to make a map of my intention. If I were just flailing all over the place and didn't do anything that had a sequence, you wouldn't do it. But now you map out my intention. Now, the intention is not only mapped out, but after that first step, what happens is you do two things. You get ready to imitate my behavior, so you might feel more likely to gesture, or you might want to get something to drink. So you can imitate behavior. That's number one. Number two, very good. Two is you're going to simulate my internal state. So to give you an example, if I go like this, you might start feeling sad.
I feel like crying when I see that.
Smile, and you see. Or you can just do this with your own body, like collapse your body. Hi, Edwin. Thanks for having me here. Man. Like this. So your body is the antenna taken in through these mirror neurons, superior temporal sulcus areas, driven down through an area called the insula, down into your lower brain areas, down into your body. Your heart changes, your intestines change, your muscles you change. And this resonance is the first step. You resonate with me. So you can, like I feel with you right now, I can feel connected to you. Or I could do this, Edwin. I could say, thank you for inviting me to talk about compassion. There is a lot of research data to show that compassion is very important for well-being. Studies of the brain show like that. I mean, I can go on like that. It's not really be here, but just sending all this information in a logical way to you. So in this setup, what we have is the body resonating and the lower brain areas resonating with what you see in someone else. This then comes back up through all sorts of channels, lamina 1 in the spinal cord, the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve. Ultimately, some of this information channels itself up to an area called the insula. It's a posterior insula, an anterior insula, and it makes a representation of what's going on in my own body. So I become aware of my own bodily state through an interaction of the insula and an area called the anterior cingulate. There's really rapid firing between those two through something called spindle cells, and that gives me a sense of what's going on in my body. Edwin is feeling present. He's positive. He's got energy, and I feel it. And then what I do is I first say what's going on inside of me, and then I move it over a little bit in this part right behind my forehead, and I say, that's what's going on in my body. I must feel good. Whoa, maybe I feel good because Edwin feels good. Yeah, he is feeling good. So based on what I felt in myself. So this is why the insula, which is an area of the brain, a set of fibers, a broad band of fibers that gets strengthened with compassion practice, including mindfulness practice, you can build this area of the brain up so you have better perception of your own body. Life becomes more vital because you're getting more signals from the body. The wisdom of the body comes up. And now you not only have more inner awareness, but that's the gateway to empathy and compassion. So now you can feel your own feelings, your body resonates, you then connect with other people because you have more inner awareness, you have more interpersonal connection, and then it feeds back because when people sense that you feel their feelings, they have what I call feeling felt. they feel felt by you, and then the connection is strong, and the whole interaction is positive and vital. And this is where the whole thing loops in a positive way to reinforce itself.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot of it here is definitions, because a lot of those components I would call empathy as well, like that resonance that happens. For me, that's kind of empathy and with the mirror neurons. So it's kind of hard to different. It's kind of seems to be more of like a process than just an individual one step or something.
Process. And some people uh, have certain steps of this process that they're really good at, and some they're more challenged at. So, for example, I have people I work with who resonate a lot. So let's call the whole thing empathy and compassion, whatever. But now we've outlined the steps of perceptual detection of signals, resonance of your body, awareness of your body state, and going from awareness of your own body state to imagining another person's mental state. We didn't use the word empathy in any of that, but let's say all of that is empathy. Here's the thing, as a therapist, or as a teacher, I want to know where a person's strengths are and where their challenging places are. And I want to focus on those challenging places and build on their strengths so that I can have someone who's really good at perceiving but doesn't allow themselves to resonate. So I got to work there. I can have someone who perceives well, resonates, but doesn't know how to take that resonance. They just get utsy in their body and they don't know what to do with it. So I need to develop this prefrontal part of the brain where they can have interoception. They can be aware of what's going on in their body, not just flooded by it. And then other people can't take it from here's what's happening in me to imagining what's happening in them. And they get stuck there. And so other people think they're, quote, narcissistic when they're not. They're just blocked from taking it from self-awareness to other understanding. So by understanding these circuits of the brain, you actually can figure out where the challenging place is. Like, for example, let's say reading perceptual signals. You can, like Paul Ekman beautifully does, teach people how to read signals that the signals were always there, but they didn't have the perceptual fine-tuned ability. And you can teach that. And as you do teach it, the beautiful thing is the brain grows in response to a learning experience like that. So you can figure out where the challenging places, build those up, and create more empathy in the individual, which of course feeds back and creates more empathy in all the people that individual is connected to.
So again, we're back to this definition. For me, I've been interviewing a lot of people about empathy and been trying to put all the pieces together. So what I'm really seeing is you're creating this differentiation of the step-by-step components, and then if you have a clear sense of each of the steps, that you can do interventions into each of the steps, kind of more targeted and specific.
Exactly.
So the definition I've been using of empathy is I've seen it as kind of a four-step process. The first part being self-empathy, so it's that sensory awareness, mindfulness of what's going on inside of ourselves. The second part is being that mirrored empathy through mirror neurons. And then kind of a third part, and that's sometimes called the affective or emotional empathy. And then the third part is an imaginative empathy, or I think some academics are calling it perspective taking or cognitive empathy. And then as we get those kind of lined up, that there's a empathic action or an empathic creativity that takes place. That when we really resonate with with someone else and have that resonance, and that we naturally want to contribute to their well-being, to creatively, if they're joyful, we want to up their joy, double their joy. And if they're like sad, we want to contribute to alleviating their sadness. And then there's kind of a parallel track of the same thing with that empathy, which is the broad spectrum of applied to any experience, any emotion or intention experience, that when it comes that compassion is kind of applied to the suffering component, that when I engage with someone who's suffering, that there's the same kind of I don't know, the wheel of empathy or the wheel of compassion is a metaphor. There's a self-compassion, which you were mentioning, Kristen Neff talks about. There's kind of like this mirrored compassion where I'm really feeling your pain and suffering, which can be quite acute. And then there's imagining the surroundings of how that pain happened. And then there's, wanting to take that compassionate action. So I don't know, how does that kind of resonate, or how does that kind of model kind of fit?
I think that's very helpful. I think for me, the core mechanisms inside of an individual, like the ones we've just outlined, are really helpful because you can find people are strong at some and not strong at others. And then you can really target your work on exactly where they need to be. I'll give you an example. Some people say they're too empathic and they don't have enough of a buffer between resonating with other people and the incredible pain they feel and the suffering of others. So when you draw on some of the brain research about this issue, there's one set of studies by Jean Dessetti at the University of Chicago, who edited a beautiful book called The Neurobiology of Empathy with some other co-editors. And in that book, the following study is discussed. If you put a person in a scanner and show them a really horrendous event on a photograph of a terrible accident, and the person takes the stance of, oh my God, what if that happened to me? Then not only do their resonance circuits get activated, but they shut down. It's too much. It becomes too much and the whole system shuts down. If in contrast to a person saying, what if that were me? A person says the equivalent of, I wonder what that person in that photograph is feeling right now, given what happened to that person. And then they have this resonance, but they don't shut down. Don't become overwhelmed. So what I say based on that and based on a bunch of other studies to, let's say, a person says I'm too empathic, is I said you have to be very careful that in your brain you've got a mind site map of me, and if everything gets stuck at the mind site map me stance, what if that were me? You won't actually be able to be empathic because you'll burn out. You have to develop your mindset map of you, this empathy circuit, so that you don't identify with everyone else's pain and you can actually do something to help them. Now, part of that is literally a prefrontal adjustment of just adjusting, saying that's not me, and literally saying that, and how can I imagine what that person's feeling, not imagining that it's me. But the other part is to understand the difference between the left and right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is very important to coordinate with the right hemisphere. Both hemispheres are really important. And if people get flooded with their body, the body senses signals primarily up to the right hemisphere. So an integrated map of the whole body is only in the right hemisphere. We've known that in neurology for over 100 years. And so when a person is getting flooded with the feeling of suffering in others and they're resonating in their body, they need to have a little bit of distance by going over to their left to intellectually, with language and logic and in a linear way, say, that is not me. That is a person suffering. And the world is filled with suffering. That's not me. That's that person. How can I help that person? It's like, picture a parent. If a parent were to encounter a child who's fallen down and whose knee is bleeding, and the child is absolutely shocked that they fell down from the tricycle and now their knee is bleeding. If the parent were to fall down in shock that their child's knee is bleeding, the child will never get help. Both of them would be screaming on the floor in agony. The parent needs to be able to see the pain, know this is a child's absolute shock and pain, and scoop that child up and care for them, whether that means just cleaning the wound or taking them to the doctor, whatever that means. But in this case, if it was just a mirroring process, we would call it too much empathy. And I wouldn't want to call it that. I would say it's too much identification with another person. It's a concept called integration, which for me helps guide our way to these different issues. Integration is honoring differences, promoting linkages. And empathy is a good example of that. You don't want to just have people linked. You need them differentiated. So the parent says, I'm the parent, my child's fallen, her knee is hurt. I will help her. Not, oh my God, we are one, my knee is hurt, and I fall on the floor writhing. So this is where integration helps you. Integration is what allows for optimal empathy to happen, where you're connected, you're feeling another person's feelings, but you're understanding they're different from you, they're differentiated from you, and therefore you have the strength and resilience and emotional reserve to go and help them. So that's what I say to the person who says I have too much empathy, is I look for how integrated they are. And they can have too much linkage and not enough differentiation, so the integration is really compromised. So integration, to me, when it's made visible, is kindness, empathy, and compassion.
So it's really an integration within oneself and with others. So it's like a multidimensional integration.
And this integration concept gets you so far. It's why the Whole Brain Child is all about that. The Mindsight book is all about it. All my books are basically taking the proposal that integration is health and looking at it in every way you can, up and down, left and right, inner and outer, neurologically, socially, every kind of way. And you can predict in the second edition of Developing Mind, you can see this, you can predict, as we did in the first edition, how integration would be a predictor of health.
Well, you were talking about people who say they have too much empathy, and I've heard that from communities. There's communities called empaths and highly sensitive people, and they say, "Oh, I have too much empathy. I don't know how to deal with it." And that quality that you're talking about, where you resonate with someone and you can't make the differentiation between yourself, or that you take it on. Sometimes that's also called sympathy. I've heard it defined as sympathy, that you're sympathizing. So it's not just you feeling their person, but it's like a secondary self feeling. And that can kind of become stressful and kind of overwhelming.
I mean, totally. I mean, there was once a question asked to me at a conference I did with John O'Donohue, Diane Ackerman, and John Kabat-Zinn. We did this wonderful 3-day conference, and at the end of it, it was all about promoting empathy and making people more compassionate if they wanted to be. And a woman got up at the microphone. She said, "I need to ask you for a question." And we said, "What's that?" She goes, "This has been an incredible weekend. I feel so connected to the world of human beings and to our planet, but I'm really mad because you've now made me more empathic and the world is filled with so much suffering. Why would you do this to me?" And I said to her what I had just heard the Dalai Lama say when I was teaching with him at another setting in Europe. And someone asked that same question. And, his response was so beautiful. And I told it to her, and I'll say it to you now. He said, it's not, in spite of the suffering of the world that we need to be joyful. But the person who had asked him said, how can you laugh so much and have so much joy in your life when there's so much suffering? He says, not in spite of it. He said, it's because of it. You have to bring joy and humor into the world, and lightheartedness and kindheartedness, because the world is filled with suffering. The world will probably always be filled with suffering. And so what we need to do is bring joy into the world so that there's more positive energy in the world. And so for people who are too empathic and see it almost as a virtue, and so they're depressed all the time and they're down and they say, well, I'm just feeling the weight of the world. From the Dalai Lama's point of view, and he spent his whole life kind of studying compassion, I think his wise words we need to take to heart, that there is a way of feeling the suffering of others and not identifying with it, and allowing ourselves, and Paul Ekman talked about this too in his meeting with the Dalai Lama, that, the Dalai Lama had this incredible way, and when Paul hung out with him, of the way I heard him describe it, of sensing another person's feelings, being totally present with that person. And then when the person's suffering was there, he was totally there with it. And when the person went off to go do what that person needed to do, and Dalai Lama was now doing other things, he could let that emotional state of connection have its own life and then let it now enter a different life. So he could be laughing and joyful and bringing positive energy into the world, even though when he was with someone suffering, he was fully there with them. And that's a quality I think that we're trying to get at, Edwin, when we talk about, empathy is not becoming depressed because of the suffering in the world. Empathy is this integrated state of connecting fully, linking fully. That's the linking part of integration, but differentiating yourself and giving yourself permission to be humorous and joyful and to dance, to sing, to laugh, to have fun, to be playful. Because otherwise, the suffering in the world has won. And it's almost a life's mission to try to reduce suffering in others, yes, but also bring more joy into the world. Not just get rid of the negative, bring the positive in. That's
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you said that about the joy, because that's what I like about empathy is I think I do kind of this freestyle dance, and it's all about empathy and relating and joyful and creativity. And how do you kind of resonate with someone with high energy, with creativity? And there's just a whole plethora of feelings. For me, my metaphor of empathy is like a cornucopia, that it kind of opens up this door, kind of this emotional plenty, this horn of plenty. That's kind of why I like the word empathy a bit more than compassion, because compassion seems to be, by definition, the suffering component. You're kind of aware of that component. Um,
in that way. And if we take the concept of empathic joy, or what some people call empathetic joy, the idea of really getting a deep, positive, energized, joyful state from another person's joy and accomplishments and success, think about the positive ripple effects. Instead, people are often having, Schadenfreude. They accept the person's demise. They take pleasure in other person's pain. I mean, so I think we need to introduce, if you want to stick with the word empathy, empathic joy, into the world to really amplify another person's positive experience. I think that's really what we need to do.
Yeah, I've been starting to use the word empathic creativity, in that when we're integrating with each other at an empathic level, that somehow the integration creates almost like sparks, if it's kind of left to integrate, and some kind of a third creative space kind of opens up, which is just immensely fun when you're creatively working together with people at an empathic level. It is just so cool.
But if we could promote more of that in the world, you would, be able to see another person's creative efforts as sort of an expression of our human family, and you would see all these positive things we could do as humans if we worked collaboratively more there. And it would be just an incredible world we would live in if we could bring more empathic joy into all of our lives. And, that's not to say that compassionate efforts to reduce suffering aren't equally important, but I think we need to balance it with empathic joy for sure.
Well, we had talked about the sympathy kind of component, or the kind of a secondary feeling when you're empathizing with someone's distress. Some of the people I talked to who were kind of in this empath community, they feel that they lose who they are, and there's whole stories of growing up and having not really been seen, not been mirrored, not been reflected, and that they are very sensitive. They're really struggling to build these boundaries. And so, you've talked about attachment, in childhood, and it seems that it's really kind of related to that, in the sense that if you haven't been seen and empathized with, and that you don't kind of have that sense of self, somehow doesn't get
Well, that's
well
a
created.
Edwin. I mean, I think we're born with a temperament, which is an often genetically shaped proclivity of our nervous system that can change a lot over time, at least with 80% of us. And we're also born with a brain that responds to experiences, so it also gets shaped by the kinds of experiences, especially we have with our caregivers. So you have genetic influences on things like temperament and experiential influences on things like attachment and your peer relationships. These work together to shape your personality. So personality is both genetically influenced and experientially influenced. It's both how we directly respond to experiences, but also how we adapt given the environment we're in, the family we're in, the culture we're in. All these things are important. So when you look at society and you look at synapses, the connection among neurons, you can actually look at it in a way where you're looking at interconnectedness of things. For me, the larger context is that energy and information are flowing within us through our nervous system throughout the whole body, and energy and information flowing between us, like what's happening right now between me and you. Empathy and compassion are examples when that flow is integrated. So whether you're looking at a society or a community or a school or a family or a relationship between one person and another, the interpersonal nature of that, and we explore this in this field I work in, interpersonal neurobiology, is all about energy and information flow patterns. And when you see these patterns as integrated, health emerges, empathy and compassion emerge, and you can then understand why it's healthy to have compassion in your life, why it's healthy to actually have this way of connecting, because the self does not need to be defined by the boundaries of the skin. And yet there's a unfortunate predisposition that the nervous system has, the brain, to interpret self as embodied by your skin. So in many ways, the problems we're having as a species are, I think, due in large part to this vulnerability the brain has to have what Einstein called an optical delusion of our separateness. That I see you in your skin-encased body, you see me in mine, and we think we're separate, when in fact, that's a delusion. The reality is there's an interconnected whole which are revealed when you're empathic and compassionate. And this, in a sense, places empathy and compassion as the root experiences internally and interpersonally that reveal integration. So that's why they are signs of health. Just that, oh, it's nice to be empathic. It actually is healthful to be empathic. It's not just nice, it's not just, oh, be a good person. This is actually where health comes in. So from my point of view, when you look at the larger system, which is looking at the mind as this embodied and relational process that's all about energy and information flow patterns within you and between you, you realize even the mind itself is not limited to the skin. It's about a relational process as well as an embodied one. And it depends on the body for sure. So I'm not separating brain from mind, but it is not just limited to the nervous system. It involves patterns of interaction between us. And that's a concept that for academics is often very hard for them to accept because it makes their research much harder. Maybe they don't agree with it also, but it certainly makes their work a lot harder to say if you're going to study a mind, you've got to study the relational context in which that mind arises and influences brain functioning. It makes that challenge more difficult. As a therapist and an educator, it becomes very clear that our relationships to each other are hugely impactful on well-being. So the number one predictor in studies of longevity, medical health, psychological health, and even, something like how the brain changes, but just stick with those, longevity and different forms of well-being, even happiness studies, relationships, supportive relationships are the number one predictor of living long, of having good medical health, of having good mental health, of being happy. So why would that be the case? That's the case not just because we have social brains, but because the mind is a social as well as an embodied process. And when we forget that, then we may puzzle and say, why is empathy and compassion so important? Well, this is why. The mind is rooted in both the body and relationships, and compassion and empathy are how you connect the body and relationships, how you honor each other's differences and then promote these compassionate and empathic linkages.
So the empathy and compassion aren't just luxuries; they're like critical, foundational qualities within us that we need to nurture and foster in society.
And it's not a I mean, you're putting it exactly right. I mean, it's in my view, it's not a luxury. And I was with my kids this weekend, and we were talking about the meaning of life and stuff like that. These are college, post-college age kids, and and I said, look, you everyone finds it for themselves, but for me, if a day happens where I can influence somewhere on the planet people's sense of being interconnected with a much larger whole than just defining the self by the bag of skin that encases them, then it was a good day. Just one little way that we can do that. And if everyone started to do that, to honor differences and promote linkages, which is basically what empathy and compassion are about, it's what kindness is about. When you talk about honoring and supporting each other's vulnerability, you know, this is a way of making a kinder world. And listen, if each one of us took something like that on as just a little bit of an intention and a project and a purpose, I mean, we would start having a different planet.
Well, that's really what the work is that I'm doing here all about, is how do we create a culture of empathy and compassion, and how do we actually create a movement, kind of an organized movement like the civil rights movement or what have you, that's really about not rights, but about fostering empathy in society and restructuring society so that empathy and compassion become foundational values, and the institutions, the legal systems, the economic systems, I mean, education systems, that they're all geared towards fostering that connection. And so what I'm kind of looking for is like ideas, like how do we go about doing it? I mean, I can say one thing we're doing is meeting in groups. We call them empathy circles. And it's all about we start with the intention, we want a culture of empathy, and we start using reflective listening and other processes, and we're developing more to kind of build that culture and see what we can do to kind of build a movement. So I'm looking for any kind of insights that you have. One was just set the intention. I heard you say you set the intention personally, and you're looking throughout the day how you can foster and nurture that empathy within society, just in your own personal life and your relationships. And just wondering what other bullet points you have in the limited time we have left.
I think that's a beautiful way of saying it, Edwin. And I think, you know, um, is fundamentally the challenge of expanding the sense of self beyond the boundaries of the skin. And that's not to make it metaphysical or anything. That's just to say that you are more than your body. And what this does is it allows people to say, wow, for another person, that's me. I need to sense the experience of that person, certainly in a differentiated way, so I don't lose myself in their suffering. But I can see the linkage part of that is that that person's me, and this is the challenge, of course, is how you invite people to do that. The other thing is that we're not just interconnected with each other as human beings, we're interconnected with this whole place we share, this home called Earth. And I think if people really started opening the boundaries of the self as not just defined by the skin, but as larger than that, you would realize you're connected not just to other people, but the whole planet. And I try to remember that with this phrase 3G, 2P. With generosity, giving back, and with gratitude, we give to the planet, to people. And this is, it's a way of life. 3G, 2P is just a simple way of remembering, how you bring into your life this way of being more empathic and kindness. And it's not just, an idea, it's a way of being. And the beautiful thing about it is it will actually allow you to have more health, more happiness, and deeper connections with other people, and a deeper sense of vitality and meaning in your own life.
Mm. Am I hearing there that it's really the intention? It's like understanding uh, the how we're connected, kind of having that sense of understanding how mirror neurons work. So that sense of understanding contributes to the desire to have the intention
Yeah,
for.
is a good starting place, but I guess the reason I'm bringing up this idea of expanding a sense of self is that um, even with the intention, I think people will feel like they're just floundering and they don't know where it goes. So this is where, for me, it's, and I know makes it harder, but it's actually not just adding intention, but challenging the belief that the self is defined by the skin. That makes the work a little more challenging, but the outcome when you do that is a deeper sense of interconnectedness. So, I guess I know enough people who say, well, my intention is to be compassionate, and then it goes nowhere, because they keep on defining the self as separate. And so then it's just a word that they have the idea of intention and the idea of compassion, and they say, I'm doing that. And whatever they do, it doesn't really make a big difference because it's not going to the deep issue, which I think is that people get locked into a self defined by the skin. And so they feel ultimately, separate.
So you really need that sense of that experiential experience of yourself connecting to something larger.
Yeah.
Maybe. So you have to feel it. You have to feel what it feels like to have that experience. You can't just think about it.
I think so. If you go to my website and do this process called the Wheel of Awareness, what we've found when I teach with my colleagues and teach this Wheel of Awareness practice is that practice, even though it's very brief, it's designed as an integration practice. And since integration made visible is kindness and compassion, then when you do an integrated practice like the Wheel of Awareness, it wouldn't be such a surprise that people who've never done any kind of reflective practice before start feeling this deep sense of interconnectedness with things. And the feedback we're getting is that it's been very transformative for many, many people. So if you've never done that before, you can do the reflective practice first and the basic mindset skills, but then do the Wheel of Awareness practice and, let us know, how it goes, because this would be the idea of going beyond just a word like empathy or something, but actually living it and feeling it and letting it become your own. Because it shouldn't be there's someone else saying, here's a good idea. It should be, here's a possible way of doing something. Try it for yourself. You decide.
Well, Dan, I love talking to you. It's such a pleasure, and kind of the spaciousness and openness and the insight and the way you kind of convey the insights. I just really enjoy this. I could go on for hours, but I know we only had an hour, so perhaps sometime we can continue or do a panel or something, because
That's beautiful. Thank you, Edwin.
so anyway, I'll then I will say goodbye, and thank you so much for having done this dialogue with me.
Thank you, Edwin. Keep up the great work.
Okay, bye.
Very good. Take care.
Take care, Dan.